So I'm based at the University of Manchester now, and at the Center for AI Fundamentals. That's what you see in the title page there. And today I'm going to talk about this work called meta-analyses of Bayesian analysis. So I hope it becomes a little bit more clear what that means in a moment. I just want to say that this is now published in the journal Bayesian Analyses, and this is kind of like to acknowledge my set of collaborators, a very good team that enabled this work to come out. So big shout out to Paul, Diego, Thomas, Yuka, and Sami Kaski. All right, just to get started into a bit of what's behind this, I'm going to give you an overview of what my talk is about. This is a short talk, so it's not much overview needed, but so I'm going to talk about what meta-analysis is, and then some, like what were the previous methods for meta-analysis that were out there, then about our work, meta-analysis of Bayesian analysis, and a couple of examples, and what's nice about this new method. That's basically the outline of my talk. So if you're familiar with meta-analysis, then this will be familiar. It's a statistical, it's a framework for like grabbing different separate statistical analyses that have some sort of relation to each other, let's say targeting the same kind of parameters, and then putting them together to form some sort of consensus analysis. And there are very good reasons that motivate this, and those reasons sometimes have to do with like increasing the power of the conclusions that you can draw from analysis by benefiting from the combined studies, and so on. So I'd like you to keep in mind that setting. Meta-analysis in general, what it is about is getting the results from separate studies. So each of the blocks here is meant to represent a separate study. Each separate study may have its own data that the study was based on and its own modeling assumptions. And then each analysis maybe output some sort of summary statistics. And then what meta-analysis tries to do is put all of those together in a consensus analysis. Okay, what was previously known? There are some methods to approach meta-analysis. There is something called the fixed effects model that basically assumes, okay, what the outputs of each separate analysis, we consider them to be fixed. There is a random effects model. I'm sorry, not the outputs, but the quantities of interest, the quantities that each analysis is targeting. So the fixed effects model considers those quantities to be non-random but unknown. The random effects models considers them to be random according to some distribution, and then those distributions go into the modeling. And just so you know, there are frequentist methods and there are Bayesian methods to approach meta-analysis. But what happened is that, as far as we are aware, all previous methods that have been developed to approach meta-analysis were based on using summary statistics, meaning point-valued estimates as the inputs for meta-analysis. So they assume that the output of each separate study is a point estimate, and therefore the meta-analysis takes all of those point estimates as inputs for the meta-analysis. So you are to combine point estimates. So that's what was like the context before. And then in this work, and this is a little bit of an example, just to give you an idea. There is a Bayesian approach to do meta-analysis. And that Bayesian approach is typically based on hierarchical modeling. Here is the quick description. If you assume that the separate studies are related via exchangeability of the local effects. By local effect, I mean the quantity of interest in each study. If you assume that they are exchangeable, then there is some theory going back to quite a bit in the theory of mathematical statistics and so on, that says that exchangeable quantities are conditionally independent, conditional on some parameter underlying all of those quantities. And that provides a way to start modeling under the assumption of exchangeability. So if you assume that the target parameters are exchangeable, then you can assume that there is this quantity, let's call it phi, which underlies all of them. We think that's the thing that relates them all. And then if you assume that that is random according to some distribution, then you can start building hierarchically. If you sample phi from that distribution, then you can think of a distribution P corresponding to that phi that generates the local effects. And then there is another distribution corresponding to that local effect that generates the data coming out of that individual study. And that hierarchical model is represented by this mathematical expression here that tells you, so think of the Q as the prior on this common quantity phi. Now here you have a posterior phi given all the summary statistics that came from the separate studies. That posterior has this form precisely because of the form of this hierarchical model. And here you can see inside all the factors involved. Here is the prior on phi. Here is, the likelihood for the local effects, and here is the likelihood for the data corresponding to the local effects. Good. What if you want to think about? So first of all, nowadays there are and for a long while actually there are many studies whose natural output is not a single summary statistic. It's not a point estimate, but it is a distribution over the quantity of interest. So one underlying question is how can we go about combining distributions if those are the outputs of the different studies? And I guess one naive way to answer is, okay, if you have a distribution, then compute its mean. That's a point estimate, and you can feed it into the previously known methods. Sure, but maybe we can do a bit better than that. And that's what we were trying to think here. There is no underlying model, though. I mean, there is no hierarchical model because we cannot go back all the way to observations. So there is that kind of question. But if we think that the outputs of each study are distributions, then I guess one kind of obvious way is we don't have access to the likelihoods anymore. We have access to these distributions. We could think about the expectations of those likelihoods with respect to those distributions. And if we use those as the factors to build an update rule, which I'm trying to convey, maybe it's natural to think that way, but if we use those, then we can think of this kind of update rule on the parameter phi. So we're still thinking that these quantities are related by exchangeability. So we're still thinking there is a common underlying parameter phi. And now we would like to update beliefs on that phi given observed distributions. So we propose that kind of rule. And I guess that's the starting point of this work. What happens if we use this rule to update beliefs on the parameters? And I'll show you in a couple of slides what are the good things that we observe in the experiments, and then in a quick summary, what are the good things with respect to the theory that we were able to prove. Somebody should tell me how am I doing with time and if, okay, good. Here is synthetic example. So this is synthetically generated data. Comparing, so in this case, what is denoted here, mu1, mu2, that's a mean parameter. But think that that's what corresponds to the phi. That's the overall parameter related in several studies. And there are 4 methods. One is FIMA, that's the fixed effects meta-analysis model. There is another, RIMA, that's the random effects meta-analysis model. Naive, I'll tell you in a moment what it is. And MBA, that's the model that we proposed based on the update rule from the previous slide. And quick observations are, if we use the fixed effects model, this cloud of, by the way, this little point here represents the true value of the parameter. Since this is a synthetic example, we choose a true value, right? And then we generate data based on that. So, and if we construct a posterior, we actually call it a super posterior because it's a posterior built on posterior distributions. We kind of wanted to convey that idea. So this is the posterior on the parameter phi, according to the update rule, for our method, for meta-analysis or data analysis. So if you use FIMA, it seems that this has a couple of bad things. One, it is biased, the whole cloud of points. So the high density region of that posterior seems to be kind of far away from the true value. And the other one is it seems to be highly confident that the true value is somewhere there at that region because there is not much spread. It looks like the naive model. Okay, I guess it's a good time to say what the naive model is. The naive model is you have those distributions coming out of each study. Instead of treating them as distributions, you simply calculate the mean. Now you have a point estimate, feed it into the traditional Bayesian pipeline. So it's a bit better in the sense that it is not too biased. Still a bit biased because the cloud, the true value is somewhere at the border of the cloud. But there is a bit more spread. It's not as confident as FEMA. Both random effects meta-analysis and our method seem to be a bit better in the sense that, well, at least the cloud of points contains the true value of the parameter. What's good about MBA? I'll mention it in a moment. Both seem to somehow reasonably describe the uncertainty in estimating this parameter underlying all the studies. This is a picture showing now what happens with the local effects. So now think there are 4 times 3, so there are 12 separate studies. And this is again synthetic data, so it has all been generated. But think that there are 12 separate studies. And now we're thinking there is a distribution for each study, and that is represented by the bigger cloud of points. And we know what's the true value because we have generated the data. And then there is a little cloud of red points. That's the updated distribution. Updated how? Well, the same methodology that led to the update rule for the overall effect can be used to define a joint distribution over all the local effects and the overall effect. And then that can be marginalized over the overall effects to get a joint distribution over the local effects only. And then that one can be marginalized for all except one, one at a time, to get marginal distributions for each of the local effects. And what happens then, it seems that, so this route, this red cloud of points has less uncertainty. So it somehow captures this idea that meta-analysis is hoped to have, that by benefit from the statistical strengths of the whole collection of studies, you improve something about what you learn about in each particular study. The estimates improve. Here, the uncertainty is reduced. And another nice property to observe is that it seems that in all of those cases, the cloud of points is not far off. It contains the true value, and it describes some uncertainty, but it is a decreased uncertainty with respect to the uncertainty of the posterior from which each study had started. That's what we call the sharing statistical strengths across the studies kind of property. And I think I have one more picture to share. And this one is not from synthetic data, but this was kind of like one step forward to how to use this method on real data. So there are some tuberculosis outbreak studies. So here's how we can think of this in sort of more real sense. Think that there is data coming from different locations. This is how I like to think about how this method could be used. There are different locations: Estonia, London, Netherlands, San Francisco. They all targeted the same kind of effect. And they all have their own data set, and they all have their own procedures that were used in order to come out with a posterior distribution. The posterior distribution is the cloud of blue points here. That's the posterior distribution that was fed to the meta-analysis. All right? Carry out the meta-analysis, and then update each of the posterior distributions, again sharing statistical strengths. You get a reduction of uncertainty in each of the places. And this is the point that I'd like to emphasize. You get to do that by using the posterior distributions only, without needing the different locations, to share data, nor necessarily details about the implementation of the original studies. So there is a bit of efficiency here. Doing this consensus analysis does not require to rerun the computations that each of those separate locations had run in order to produce their own posterior distribution. Did that come across? That's one of the selling points of this method, that there is some saving in terms of computation. And I think that's pretty much summarizing the main messages of what I wanted to say. So we have proposed this learning rule. I try to show in pictures what are the important highlights of the what we observed in the experiments. There were some theory properties that were very nice to see. In classical Bayesian learning, there are these two properties, those two theory properties that give a lot of justification for using Bayesian updates. One of them is called order invariance in successive updates. You have two data points. Let's call them data point 1 and 2. If I process them in order 1, 2, or in order 2, 1, I get the same posterior. That's what this property says. And it turns out that this rule has that property. It's invariant with respect to the order in which you process the updates. And the other one is concentration in the limit of infinite observations. The more observations, the more data you feed to the model, the more the model should shrink around a region of high probability. Again, the experiments show these two properties. We can reuse pre-computed posteriors. We don't have to compute them again. We can use them as given, and to do a consensus analysis. And there is this property which is sharing strengths across the individual studies in order to refine, the conclusions from a study, conclusions being in terms of posteriors, and the implementation consists seems to be quite reasonable. Details in the paper. One more thing that I want to say is I like to call it this is a form of distributional analysis as opposed to point-valued analysis. Point-valued, the inputs being point values versus the inputs here being whole distributions. Some questions that were left out, I guess, is what is the form, what is the ideal form to share distributions. In this paper, we experimented with sharing distributions, representing the shared distributions by samples. So what one study was sharing with the other was samples from the corresponding posterior distributions. Or what the meta-analyst receives from each of the local studies is a collection of samples from the posterior. What is the best way to share posteriors? What is the best way that could be used to share posterior distributions is something to think about for the future. Last thing I want to say is many thanks to all of you, to all the organizers, University of Manchester, Manchester Center for AI Fundamentals, and the Pankhurst Institute, with whom we are very good friends, provides very nice facilities. Thank you very much for listening.